Hey everyone, I hope you guys are enjoying Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak on either your Nintendo Switch and on PC. Today I wanted to bring up something of a little bit of an interesting discussion topic that I saw brought up in one of the Monster Hunter subreddits, where someone simply suggested that they were simply tired of fighting flagship monsters from previous generations, and they kind of hoped for Capcom to simply just make more new monsters and stop returning monsters to continually appearing in every brand new release. So while I don't necessarily agree with that idea, but I certainly want to give it a little bit of a voice, I want to flip that question on its head and ask you guys, would you actually be interested in Capcom to make sure that every single Monster Hunter release heading forward just automatically out of the gate includes every single previous flagship monster that has become available in base Monster Hunter, which of course that includes 5 different generations of monsters. I will make this point though. I'm also going to make it clear that we have to exclude Frontiers from this. Everything from Frontiers, Frontiers Forward, Frontiers G, and Frontier Z. We just simply cannot add all of those flagships because obviously most of them have never actually made it to the base 5 generation releases. And there's just so many of those monsters. Only Teostra and Espinas, considering flagships from Frontiers, have ever even made it to a base Monster Hunter game. Espinas now being the second one, Teostra being around for quite a bit. So, you know, it's just simply one of those things where like Frontiers kind of has to be excluded from the discussion for obvious reasons. Certainly we can have a future conversation regarding which Frontiers monsters and which Frontiers flagship monsters should be making their way into the next generation of monsters, presumably the next release for Monster Hunter, or even as part of Sunbreak's continual free title updates. But, you know, I don't necessarily think that would be a really realistic thing to really get into as of right now. So I certainly want to hear your opinions on which one of the flagships you think should be continually added in future Monster Hunter games. Because let's face it, usually when a brand new Monster Hunter game is revealed, the flagship is the first thing that we see. They are plastered pretty much everywhere. They are the monster that most likely will end up getting a demo of. Usually that has always been the case. And is the monster that pretty much everyone kind of gets used to seeing relatively often. Is one of those monsters that you know is going to be a little bit of a wall, a little bit of a difficult encounter before you start getting into Elders and presumably, of course, the last monster in that specific generation's release. So certainly flagships hold a little bit of a spot in people's hearts, and they have become relatively well known as for each one of the generations. And just to go over some of those, I'm going to give a huge shout out to the Monster Hunter fandom wiki. They have a pretty clear layout for all the generations and the flagships for each one of the releases. When it comes to the first generation, of course, for PlayStation 2 and the PSP, for Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Freedom, Rathalos was the flagship monster. Obviously, Rathalos has been the flagship for quite a while. Rathalos has already been pretty much included in every single one of the releases. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything that Rathalos will continue to reappear in just about every single one of the games. And while still being part of the first generation, Monster Hunter G, Azur's Rathalos was the flagship for that release, also part of the PlayStation 2 era of releases. Azur Rathalos hasn't necessarily appeared in every single one of the games. Certainly he is not part of Rise and or Sunbreak yet. We kind of were hoping it would be, but it hasn't been. And, you know, it has appeared, I believe it had appeared in Iceborne at that point. So it has been one of those that appears kind of like on and off, but not continually in every single release. Moving into the second generation, Monster Hunter 2 had Kushala Daora as the flagship monster, and Kushala Daora has been, when it comes to the Elders, at the very least, the base 3 Elders, Teostra, Chameleos, and Kushala Daora, it has probably been the more prominent one and the one that has appeared in the most amount of games. Also, of course, for Portable Second and Freedom Second, Tigrex was the flagship monster, and Tigrex as well has appeared in multiple of the Monster Hunter releases, probably just as much as Rathalos, of course excluded from the first generation. And Portable Second G and Freedom Unite has Nargacuga, another flagship that has just been a fan favorite all along, kind of like Rathalos and Tigrex. And of course, Sinogre subsequently in the third generation. I would put all these monsters in pretty much the same tier, as they have not just become fan favorites, but they were flagships and they have pretty much appeared in every release going forward. Of course, the third generation gets us into the first monster that this discussion would probably circle itself around, and that is the fact that for Monster Hunter 3, Lagiacrus was the flagship monster. And of course, laggy has simply not become available in many games, especially since they moved on to a brand new generations with World, Iceborne, Rise, and Sunbreak. Laggy simply has not been there, and that is one of those monsters that people keep asking for. We have had multiple discussion videos already regarding Laggy returning, maybe not even for Rise, maybe not even for Sunbreak, but just the future generations. And developers have said multiple times that is because of the skeletal body, its movements, and the way that they designed the monster that they cannot get it to work. Obviously, that brings up echoes of Rathalos. Rathalos was completely reworked for World, and ultimately it was one of those monsters that, you know, it just plays different now than it did originally in previous generations. So if Rathalos, literally the main flagship monster of this franchise, can get reworked, I'm sure Laggy can get the same treatment. Continuing for the third generation, Portable Third has Zinogre as the flagship, and of course now Zinogre has become a staple in the franchise. Stygian Zinogre, while not at a flagship, has been also extremely popular. It doesn't appear in every game, but Stygian is also another really popular one. 3G and 3 Ultimate featured, of course, Brachydios, and Brachy to me is one of the first favorite monsters that I ever had when I first played Monster Hunter back on the 3DS. And Brachy, for me personally, it should be in every single game. It's just one of those really unique monsters, especially with the slime mechanic. But again, we don't see it appear pretty much everywhere. And I feel like that should be one of those things, like as a flagship, as a fan favorite, it should certainly be appearing everywhere else. Fourth generation included, of course, Monster Hunter 4's Gore Magala. And it pretty much went on it for World and Iceborne up until now in Sunbreak, where it finally made a comeback. And hopefully, now it's a flagship as a fan favorite, and Capcom realizing that, it should continue to release heading into the future. 4G and 4 Ultimate has Tigrex. The same thing you can literally say with Gore Magala. It just simply wasn't available until now and Sunbreak. And, you know, it's one of those monsters that, again, a fan favorite, it should continue to appear into the future. Monster Hunter X, or Generations as it was known here in the West, had Glavelus technically as the flagship monster, but of course, Mitsuzune, Gameth, and Astalos, defeated 4, if you will, were part of the flagship group. It wasn't necessarily Glavelus, although Glavelus did get all the glamour and glory. Mitsuzune, Gameth, and Astalos were also part of that group as well. So let's not forget those flagships, and technically they are like a step below Elders, so they should kind of be like focused and you know, added in just about every single one of the races. Of course, Monster Hunter Double Cross, or Generations Ultimate as it was known in the West, had Valstrax on the flagship cover. But interestingly enough, the website does state that when it comes to Deviants, Bloodbath Diablos for Generations Ultimate was also another flagship considered by Capcom. So it's interesting that, of course, Valstrax, of course, simply just hadn't made a comeback up until Rise and Sunbreak, but you know, as a different Crimson Glow, not necessarily even base Valstrax. But of course, when it comes to Deviants, which there were many in base Generations, and Generations Ultimate even added more, especially of the Elder Dragon types or Fated 4 type. You know, it was one of those games that, you know, now has multiple monsters that I think could have easily been part of, you know, flagship monsters that should have continually made their way into future releases. Of course, moving on to the 5th generation, we have Nergigante as the flagship of Monster Hunter World. And I mean, Nergigante should just appear in every game going forward. That thing is such a fun fight to have. It would be just a huge miss if, for whatever the next game is, Nergigante does not make an appearance. That thing is such a fun fight. It's so unique with the spike mechanics and all of that. So certainly want to see more Nergigante for sure. And the same thing can be said for Volcana's Iceborne flagship monster. Volcana is one of those really popular ones, of course, here in Sunbreak. Then let's make sure that at the very least Capcom knows to make this flagship available into subsequent games. Of course, Magnamalo now being the unique and flagship monster for Rise, and Malzeno being the flagship monster for Sunbreak. I think Malzeno is probably going to end up getting one of those Valstrax treatments. I kind of have that weird feeling because it's just so intricately tied to the story of Sunbreak and the Curios themselves. And I don't particularly see the Curios making their way into whatever future generations are going to happen. So kind of like Valstrax kind of like got omitted for World. I see Malzeno kind of just making a weird appearance in some future release later on, but not necessarily whatever the next mainline game will be. Magnamalo, I do think it will. It's just probably a more normal monster. Is, I would say, less unique than Malzeno in that regard. So I can certainly see it making an appearance more often than not. But that's pretty much all the base Monster Hunter flagships that we do have that, part of this discussion, I would think, because they have become something of fan favorites, because they were the flagships of a specific release, Capcom would go well to just simply say, hey, every release going forward, we're going to make sure that these monsters are part of that. Whatever the, total number of monsters are going to be available for that game's release, whether it's Monster Hunter 6, Monster Hunter World 2, whatever that game will be, or even subsequent releases after that, these monsters are just simply part of that story continuing forward, since they are just, so unique, have so much story, so much lore behind it, and they are beloved by many people. I think it would go a long way for Capcom to consider doing that. But I certainly want to hear your guys' opinions. Do leave a comment. Let me know if you actually would love to see the continuation of these monsters appearing in subsequent releases, or would you be willing to ditch every single one of them? Not a single one of them returns in a future release, with the understanding that those slots are taken in by brand new monsters. However uncommon that may be, or unlikely that may be, it would be interesting to hear your guys' opinions. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.